If you want to beat the rest, you've got to play against the best. So this is standard Jammy HB, but with a little twist. I'm actually going to experiment around with Sansan City Grid, and I'm up against Andromeda. Because it is not Wizard, I don't really have to worry too much about medium yet. I'm going to just pitch my CVS in the bin. Also helps if my opponent is trying to farm CVS Data Sucker tokens from archives. Block that out immediately. And immediately, as I said, that my opponent goes for Temujin or archives, which seems a bit of an odd decision considering that my opponent wants to clear cards from the hand. But we can quickly see why my opponent made this decision. He plays a Dirty Laundry from hand, followed by a daily cast that you'll see later. So that allows him to go up all the way to 9 credits, but with a cast ticking down and a Temujin with 12 credits ready to go. Passing the turn over to me, I'm left in kind of an awkward situation. Get your thinking caps on because I need you to help me do some thinking here. Given that the Eyes on HQ is a Fairchild 3, and the one in hand is also another Fairchild 3, what is the best decision tree that I can adopt for this coming turn? Give it a thought. I'll review what I did and perhaps what I should have done shortly. Have you paused the video to figure it out yet? Well, I'm going to review my thought process now. So, the first thing is you notice that my opponent played this very well. He pointed Temujin on archives, even though it seems like R&D is the more obvious choice since it's equally unprotected and he can get a free access off of it. However, by doing this, he really forks me this turn, giving me a very difficult decision tree. If I place my Fairchild on archives, I stop the Temujin, but I leave R&D extremely vulnerable. Considering that I only have one agenda in hand, it's probably not very wise to give my opponent multiple accesses on R&D. I might not see the next piece of ice for a long time. If the Fairchild goes on R&D, my opponent shoots up in credits like crazy, going up to easily 20 or more credits by the end of turn 2 or 3, allowing him to set up all his breakers incredibly quickly and lock all my servers down. Doesn't look good either. I can only choose one server or the other. So, which would you have chosen? What would your first click have been? Because of this fork, it's quite obvious that my first click should be to draw. If I'm able to draw a piece of ice, my second click and third click can be spent on installing both pieces of ice, or more likely, install one ice and install advanced assembly lines, and use advanced assembly lines to install the second ice. That way, I secure all 3 centrals, and I don't have to worry about bleeding credits to Temujin or bleeding accesses of R&D. Unfortunately, as you'll see in this video, I do not get the ice that I need, forcing me to change plans. I reckon a lot of you would have probably chosen to put the Fairchild on archives just to stop the Temujin bleed, and leave R&D open in the hopes that my opponent doesn't have a medium or a keyhole to completely wreck and abuse the open R&D. And that's probably the right call. Here, you can see me making what is probably the wrong call, which is to ignore the other 2 centrals completely and go for a rush style setup on the remote. With this, I have a Sansan secured behind a Fairchild 3, which allows me to then quickly pump out agendas. Along with the 2 Bartic neighbors in hand, my hope here is that I'll be able to score out to 7 points before my opponent even gets the opportunity to set up all 3 breakers. Knowing that I cannot contest the huge money start of my opponent, nor can I tax out my opponent by icing up centrals because I didn't draw enough ice in my opening turns, it seems like the most obvious thing to do is to just go out for the quick score. But here you see me bleeding an agenda, definitely not looking good. And here's where I make the mistake. If I committed myself to going all in on the remote, I really should not be backpedaling. I should try to just go all in on the score. The architect should have gone on the server, in the remote server instead of R&D. My thought here was that by protecting R&D, I will allow myself to see agendas which I can then score with Sansan. The problem is the Sansan is behind Fairchild 3, which is completely clickable. So I really am not giving myself a good opportunity to win this game if I'm being half-hearted in my defenses on the remote and R&D. I need to secure one server completely, especially if it's the remote server, with the Sansan. Sansan is extremely crucial, and if I can actually set up that server, I'm actually in a very good position to push out the rest of the agendas for the rest of the game. Unfortunately, with this setup here, I can't viably score the Vitruvius that's in my hand even. Because if I do, I can be very sure that my opponent will try to contest the Sand next turn and surely be able to kill it, given that my opponent is so rich. So instead, what I'm doing here is to just hyper draw to the best of my ability, trying to find ice to secure either R&D or my remote. And I do find it itchy. And once again, I place it on the wrong server. Because I'm reacting to the mimic that my opponents installed in reaction to seeing the architect or R&D, I'm always one step behind. And this is a big problem. When Jammy HB is playing one step behind, they can't win, because I'm supposed to be one step ahead, scoring agendas before my opponent can contest the remote. The fact that I'm one step behind is causing a lot of problems. And now that I'm actually forced to rest my HQ ice, I'm going to be set back even further. This is one turn later that I'm going to start scoring, because next turn I'll need to actually build up my money, play the hedge fund or the blue level from my hand, because being forced to pay 6 credits for this fresh out 3 means that I can't score the Vitruvius on Sand and then defend the Sand in the same turn. The only respite for me here is that my opponent face planted into fresh out 3 on click 2 without a decoder, meaning my opponent is forced to eat all 3 subroutines. And this is where I start deciding whether I should end the run or deal a brain damage to my opponent who is on 1 card in hand. What would you do in this situation? Give it a think, pause the video if you need some time, and figure out what you think is the best move to make. So when evaluating brain damage versus end the run, we need to take 4 factors into account. Firstly, my opponent will be left with 2 clicks after the run, so they can potentially abuse the fact that they made a successful HQ run to perform successful HQ run stuff, such as installing political operative, or worse still, using emergency shutdown on Fairchild 3. Now, this is actually not a concern for this particular scenario, and we can more or less rule it out, simply because if my opponent makes a successful run, he must have taken 1 brain damage, which means that the hand size will be down to 0. So I don't actually have to worry about my opponent having a shutdown or pull-up in their hand. That is not a concern. What's more concerning, however, is the mileage that my opponent will be getting out of the HQ run. The Desperado credit is nice to have, but it's the Data Sucker counter that is really problematic. As you know, with Data Sucker, it can easily snowball out of control once they get a couple going. Knowing that there's a CVS in archives, the only way my opponent's getting sucker counters is on HQ or R&D. So by stopping my opponent from getting the first sucker counter, I will be in a much better position than if I were to give it to him. And that's more important than the third factor, which is agenda in hand. There's only 1 in 5 agendas in hand, the other 4 are not even trashable cards. I'm more than happy for him to come in for a 20% shot if it means taking a brain damage, which is the last factor. Brain damage is not that good against non-foul stacks. My opponent is a standard Andromeda. Unless I hit a breaker, that brain damage is not going to be worth much. Turns out ultimately, however, my opponent told me after the game that the last card in hand was actually his only Corroder. So yes, my opponent's not even playing Paperclip. So yep, in that particular scenario, I should have done the brain damage, but in 9 out of 10 situations otherwise, I think I made the right call by ending the run. I couldn't afford to give my opponent the extra Data Sucker counter, and the 20% chance to hit a Vitruvius is a bonus reason why I shouldn't let my opponent in the first place. Whatever the case is, this is more of a misplay on my opponent's part than anything else. Against HB nowadays, with Fresh Out 3.0 being a thing, it's always safest to run first click into unknown ice. I know it's not possible to do that all the time, but it's something that you have to keep in mind. Be prepared to take the subroutines. So here I just play a blue level clearance and I ditch an architect because my opponent has mimic out. Architect becomes a lot less tempting now that mimic is actually out. Resing for 4 for an ice that costs 2 to break is not the best trade you can get. I'm starting to become swamped with agendas. Actually, not really. There's only 2 agendas, now only 1 in my hand. The problem with this, however, is that now my opponent will simply run the remote to trash the Sand. There's no reason for my opponent not to, and that's exactly what happens. So there we go. The Sand gets trashed here, and that's all good. What should I do here? I put the Vitruvius in and hope that my opponent doesn't check it. This was a huge mistake. This is a very huge mistake. I've drawn through nearly half my deck, and there are only 2 agendas in the score area. My opponent should figure that there are lots of agendas in my hand. Compounded with the fact that I ended the run on HQ instead of inflicting the brain damage, my opponent at this point would be thinking to themselves, he must be flooded, he's trying to jam agendas in that remote. I should contest that. And it's very simple for my opponent, just run the remote, click 3 times. That I should have taken into account. This was a very big mistake from my side that cost me the game. What I should have done in that scenario was to install the vanilla on the Fairchild 3. That would allow me to protect the Vitruvius for sure, because my opponent did not have a Fractor on the board, nor did he have a decoder, so my opponent was not able to break through vanilla Fairchild 3 on their first click. I should have placed the vanilla there, so this I would have been able to score the Vitruvius this turn instead of attempting to jam a second Vitruvius. Big mistakes. My opponent now runs R&D trying to fork me, and that's a pretty good fork. I'm not able to score the Vitruvius very easily this turn. All I can do is to res the Ichi, and then tax my opponent by resing the Architect, leaving me at very few credits, not a good credit level to score the Vitruvius in the remote, and things are made worse by the fact that my opponent did manage to fetch an ABT off the top. This is looking incredibly bad for me. My opponent's on match point, I'm nowhere near winning, and I'm super poor. I still decide to score the Vitruvius here, even though my opponent probably can't get into it next turn. At this point, since most of my ice is res, it doesn't really matter whether I'm on 3 credits or 0, unless a hedge fund is coming up. And my opponent gives me even more bad news. He's not just going to tread water with those sucker counters, he's going all in with double sucker. Double sucker allows my opponent to collect enough data sucker counters for the rest of his life, and this is really bad for me. Every R&D run now costs 5 credits, which is not all that much, 4 even if they let me fire the trace on the Ichi. So my opponent still has a good amount of money left, can easily bust through R&D a couple more times, so it doesn't make sense for me to open up R&D by drawing cards off R&D here. The only thing I can do right now is to gear check my opponent with the vanilla on R&D. Again, another huge mistake. Given that R&D is meant to be taxing, what I really should be doing here is to put the Eli on R&D, even if it means I can't res it. Putting a vanilla there only cost my opponent an extra 1 credit. Eli would have at least cost my opponent 2 credits, if not more. 2 credits usually, because my opponent has a lot of data sucker counters. So very big mistake for me to put the vanilla there and then have the useless Eli sitting on archives. That seems like I'm putting them the wrong way around, and indeed I am. So just very awful play from me right here. The ice is all in the wrong place. I did not put enough ice on the remote before attempting to jam in there. Lots of big mistakes, and the game is basically over at this point. My opponent finds their last breaker and has more than enough sucker counters to stay afloat against the Fairchild 3s. At this point, only stacked Fairchild 3s can put a dent in my opponent's breaker suite. With a single Fairchild 3 on HQ, it's a completely porous server. My opponent abuses that by siphoning me, regaining the 2 sucker credit counters, and then using it to get through HQ for the final global food. This was very poorly played by me, and I deserve to lose. Hopefully you see some of the decision points I made throughout the game and how changing those decisions would have affected the outcome of the game. Well, that's how it is. Thanks for watching and happy net running. See you around.